Neil Cohn is an American cognitive scientist and comics theorist who works at Tilburg University. In this interview, he works through how his research on the acquisition of visual languages in comics literacy relates to the broader acquisition of all the cognitive structures that allow us to make sense of the world. I gravitated to Cohn's newest book, Who Understands Comics, to some extent because of the acclaim it had received, but mostly because I'm a devotee of the medium, although we talk about whether it should even be regarded as a discrete medium. Who Understands Comics is, in Cohn's words, his psychology book. He explains that the questions he wanted to ask about the ways that we comprehend comics really dictated that he used these more quantitative styles of analysis. That said, his work is deeply interdisciplinary, and he talks about how working across different fields of thought provided a way to avoid a lot of the issues of running into disciplinary constraints in your research that can often shut down conversations, collaborations, and critiques before they occur. He also relates how the hybrid approach that he was using to understand how comics work when he was a graduate researcher meant that nobody knew what to do with him. These moments of blockage forced him to find new routes for doing justice to the power of graphic storytelling, to devise a way to conduct experiments that would inform his theory and theoretical frameworks that could be shaped and revised on the basis of experimentation. While acknowledging all of the comforts of familiarity, Cohn says he's committed to creating space for contesting key heuristic assumptions about how readers of graphic texts do the work of supposedly, filling in the gaps within and between panels. That particular assumption that readers are responsible for kind of manufacturing missing information that the cartoonist doesn't provide, and that readers are somehow automatically just spontaneously able to do this, it doesn't stand up to empirical research, he says. Especially if we do that research across multiple different cultural contexts and traditions. Cohn stresses that there's just not enough awareness of the importance of cultural difference in comics theory. But these are crucial, these differences, for thinking through the evolution of distinct systems of visual language. So we may have a cursory sense of the differences between the libraries of comic storytelling in Japan, France, the US, and Canada, but a cursory understanding tends to move us into totalizing about all comics, as though all comic storytellers follow the same patterns when they write, which they don't. Comics are trivialized because they're fun. Because they're fun. This way of communicating appeals to people through levity, lavish artwork, the loving integration of text and image. They're cinematic. So it was really terrific to speak with him about his path-breaking research on comics as a visual language. The questions that I wanted to ask you do have to do with Who Understands Comics, questioning the universality of visual language comprehension. But I had a question about Henry Jenkins, who, has this book on comic studies. It's his intervention in comic studies. I don't know if you've read this book.
I'm afraid I haven't, so I can't comment with expertise.
That's totally fine. But it's literally just called Comics and Stuff. And, I see basically connections to your work.
Okay.
And especially this idea that of blockage. Like there's this concept of how certain comics are invested in what blockage can do to readers. And interestingly, you note that you don't see it as much in American comics.
Yeah.
But what you do see a lot of are splash pages. This is something that Jenkins spends a great deal of time thinking about in Comics and Stuff. The impact of splash pages in graphic novels. He sees them as these crucial moments where cartoonists pick a particular, time to just slow down the reader. He says to encourage contemplation amid an experience otherwise dominated by the plot, which feels like blockage to some extent. But that's not, to me, what splash pages do exactly. And even though Jenkins offers a couple of close readings of, gorgeous examples of splash pages from comic fiction, he doesn't make it clear to me how splash pages connect to his larger argument about the specific fixation in comics on the power of stuff, the like almost magic quality of things.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you care about splash pages and their unique ability? You know,
Do I care about
like, do you care about them, and do you think they have this specific importance in comics that Jenkins clearly thinks they do?
Yeah. So it's funny. I haven't really thought about splash pages in that context. So I guess to return to the model I present in Who Understands Comics, which is work that's not only presented there but is also in other places, is that the system of the visual languages that are used in comics have multiple component parts to them. So among those parts are the structure of the graphics themselves. So to break it down for listeners who are not familiar, there's kind of three tiers, which is there's a modality, meaning, and grammar. The modality in this case is the graphic elements of visual representations. The meaning is the information that is being conveyed. And the grammar is essentially how that information is being conveyed. The organizational structures that lead to the conveyance of meaning. Across those tiers of modality, meaning, and grammar, it divides this up into both sequences and units. So each modality, meaning, grammar applies to the units, and there's particular structures involved with the units. And then it also is involved with the sequencing. And crucially here, there's a distinction I think that's important to make between the sequential meaning, the narrative structures, which are the structures that guide that meaning, and the layout or the composition, which is the physical arrangement of elements on a page or on a canvas, if you want to speak more abstractly. So I think oftentimes people conflate or confuse the narrative structure and the layout, which is the spatial organization of the elements of the story and the contents. So splash pages are an element of the layout, of the way in which the content becomes physically arranged. So you can manipulate layouts without manipulating the narrative structure. That said, there may be patterned ways that layouts and narrative structure go together. So I think a reasonable, and we are looking at this in our research, and this really comes down to both, well, you can do it both by experiments, as in psychological experiments, testing different manipulations for whether, what the effect is of a splash page for any given narrative state, let's say. Or you can also look at it in a corpus, which is also what we have done quite a lot of, which is we've gathered data by annotating and analyzing properties of comics from around the world. We previously did this with an analysis of 300 plus comics from Europe, the United States, and Asia. But in our current work, we're expanding this to many, many, many more countries and many, many, many more comics. So a prediction might be, for example, that splash pages show you the climactic moments of a sequence because they're giving emphasis and size to those climactic moments. Mm-hmm. There's an analogy that I've been kind of exploring lately, which I've thought about for decades since I was in college, but I've actually never written it up anywhere, which is that a byproduct of the effect of layouts is that layouts kind of give you a sense of prosody to the experience of a visual language. So prosody in speech is the overarching sort of sound structure that might give you cues about meaning. This is the intonation patterns, things like that. There's some work by a Japanese manga theorist named Fusanosuke Natsume. And there's actually a very nice translated article of his by John Holt and another translator whose name escapes me right now that just recently came out. And Natsume has this belief that's similar to this idea of prosody in layouts, that the size and organization of layouts gives you a sense of kind of compression and release, depending on where along a page the panels are and the sizing of the panels relative to other panels. And this is really the same sort of sense like a prosodic sort of structure that's giving you emphasis to different elements, that as you read, you are kind of getting a sense of compression as you say, travel down a column, and then expansion as you open up into a large panel, something like that. These have not been, these ideas have not really been explored experimentally yet, but I think that there's something to them, and it's worth sort of thinking about those sorts of functions that the layout provides that kind of also facilitates meaning, even though the layout itself is not meaningful.
Yeah, and I'm so interested in this element of comics. It increases the immersiveness and the kind of rhythmic nature of them.
Yeah, the rhythm is the prosody, exactly right.
Yeah, and I have questions too about like the relationship between music and comics, because I think in both instances you see the evolution of what is felt to be a higher form of language or a richer form of communication that is also assumed in many cases to have these therapeutic uses. Like music is
Yeah.
often used to help people reacquire speech, for example. So I want to come back to that for sure. I really want to come back to the specific methodology of who understands comics, which you
Mm-hmm.
gestured to. This really massive kind of study that is capacious by virtue of the methods that it's adopting.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm super interested in that, especially how it models a new, I think, in some ways, method of visual analysis. But I want to stay with this question of like layout and prosody. I like that you point out in your work, for example, that readers of comics often do a global visual search of the
Mm-hmm.
page, or even I think the whole book sometimes. And Henry Jenkins talks about how we flip as comic readers. I wondered if you could explain or expand on your idea that this is actually not an erratic thing that comics readers are doing, but maybe part of the process of like picking up the visual lexicon of the book they're reading, the tone, the grammar
Right.
of the visual narrative.
Sure. So that connects to what would be, I think, was chapter 2 in Who Understands Comics, which was all about the
Yeah.
processing of
Hmm.
visual sequences. Much of that was based on my own work in doing both behavioral experiments and cognitive neuroscience experiments on how the brain understands sequences of images. But in the time since, say, my earlier books, where there was really only a handful of empirical studies when I was doing, say, my dissertation on this. Since that time, there's been quite a lot of more studies being done by people who are not me, which is fantastic. Um,
Hmm.
and so I tried to integrate a lot of the insights that has come over the last decade into that chapter. And the kind of result has been this overarching sort of processing, sort of flow of processing, which
Hmm.
I call the PINS model. But ultimately, what the PINS model breaks down into is that when you are reading a comic or navigating a comic or any sort of engaging with a visual sequence, you are you're not just dealing with it as a blank slate. You have, hopefully, if you are proficient, you have acquired different cognitive structures that you're trying to build in the course of this understanding. So, in the case of layout, you're trying to build a cohesive sort of structure of assembling together panels into sort of an organized chunking form that's not just a linear path moving through a page. It's you're trying to actually build these chunks that are helping you to navigate and organize the information. The same thing happens in the narrative structure. The narrative structure is a sort of grammatical structure where you're building chunks of information as you progress through a visual sequence. And in meaning, you're building a mental model that's an understanding of the meaning and the situation that is going on in any given comic. Now, you're using those cognitive structures, and as you are engaging the pieces of a comic, each panel, also the same sort of process is what happens when you engage words and sentences and whatnot. And linguists and psycholinguists have been exploring these for decades now. And much of what we're showing in the visual sequences that similar mechanisms are going on in the visual sequencing and the digesting of the visual information as in the verbal information. And then, of course, there's an added aspect where you're integrating the verbal and visual, which I don't even really go into that much because you have to start somewhere. So we are going into that. We are exploring those, but it's just a bit complex to do it all at once.
Yeah, and I like that nonetheless, in the book you are providing this interesting set of terms for trying to begin to grasp for just basically doing the research.
Yeah.
For example, like the thing that I was thinking about, one practical application, an everyday application, is the fact that you're talking about early childhood acquisition of a visual lexicon, which is at a time when it's still relatively easy to pick up the skill of drawing. And you say, like, the sentiment of "I can't draw" actually reflects the insufficient learning of a visual vocabulary.
Yeah.
And I think Linda Barry, among graphic novelists, is so insightful on this. Like, she wonders why people don't draw into adulthood,
Right.
in a sense, like queering the assumption that it's immature to draw. And in her teaching, she says that it's, she's partly trying to walk people back to drawing. That's how she puts it.
Yeah.
And this seems to like hinge on like learning a visual vocabulary. And I just feel like it would be a boon to the creative capacity of people in general if we could convince people to continue drawing.
Sure.
But to kind of connect it to what you were just saying, like, do you think that it's partly about how complex the multimodal nature of images and text working together actually is? Like, you write about how comics represent the interaction between different types of input, and that we make choices when we read, and especially when we create these kinds of chunks, these images that are narratively driven. Is this about the work that our imaginations have to do to build a kind of grammar?
Well, I think it's not just about the amount of work that we have to do, but it's about learning the structures that we need in order to do that. And ultimately, a vocabulary is not just words. Even in just a spoken language, the vocabulary also includes the constructions that we use in grammars, the idioms we use, and information at larger and smaller sizes of patterns. And the same is true in visual sequencing as well. The lexicon of visual languages includes both the individual elements and how we draw them, how to draw an eye, how to draw a hand, how to put those together into a body, but also the patterns involved with visual sequencing and the patterns involved in layouts. And all of this information needs to be acquired in order to competently understand, say, a whole comic. What I was going to get at and I don't want to entirely get into the realm of drawing and drawing development, because that's a whole nother huge conversation that I've written extensively about. If you're wanting me to focus on the who understands comics part, then that's a whole other big can of worms.
That's the thing. It is just gestured to, but it's this whole other body of research.
Yeah. I mean, the part of the thing is that all of this is interconnected. And in the other works of mine that I'm currently working on and other places, I've tried to provide the kind of broader overview of the global view of the system in its entirety. But that's really hard because it's a very complex, multifaceted system. So you can only get so much. Who Understands Comics is essentially the psychology book about the comprehension of comics, where other work of mine is about the specifics of the lexical items and the structures that are going on. This book was really more about the comprehension processes, or the developmental processes, or the different aspects of the brain that may be different in neurodiversities, and how that affects understanding of comics, and the idea of proficiency as a whole, which are much more kind of psychological notions than the structural patterns. Now, you don't entirely have a separation between the psychological processes and the patterns, because the processes are using the patterns, but they're at least you can identify them in different ways. This is what in psychology we'd call the differences between, say, representations and processing.
Mm.
Representations being the patterns and the elements of knowledge, and the processing being the way in which we operate. We have operations or mechanisms that deal with that knowledge. So Who Understands Comics is very much my kind of psychology-driven book, as opposed to earlier work and other current work that is more about the kind of linguistic representations, or the representations that are involved. So if I go back to that part, some of the processes that are involved are things like, if you first need to access information, on the basis of which, once you've accessed that information, you can perhaps make predictions about what happens next. And then as you get new information, you might assess whether those predictions are being upheld, or whether you need to update your idea of what structures are on the basis of new information. So to go back to what you had originally talked about kind of visual search. So one possibility when you first engage a page is that you're going to search around the page because you're looking for information to access. But you might not do that blindly, as in, I'm just going to radically look around a page. Your knowledge, your representations might guide you to not even do that sort of search process. Maybe with your knowledge, you're going to be very focused in knowing, well, I know that pages usually begin in the upper left-hand corner, so I'm going to direct my eyes straight to that corner without needing to search very much. And you do see this in studies of eye tracking. You'll often see, sometimes you'll see visual search, especially for more challenging page layouts. But if it's a grid pattern, people very much go straight to that upper left corner. So it's not like an all or nothing thing. It's somewhat based on the properties of the page, as in what you can immediately acquire in one fixation with your peripheral vision, etc., to then realize, okay, this is a page that I can go straight to the left-hand corner with, or not. Or maybe you know that you should, but you want to kind of explore a page anyways, just to check out what's going on. So you're not deterministically bound by these mechanisms, but there's different options given what knowledge you have. And similarly, once, if you're like, well, I'm going to go right to the upper left-hand corner, and I know that this is a grid, or I can very easily acquire what the reading path is. Proficient readers will have a fairly directed reading path, and they can read fairly smooth and fairly quickly through a layout without much, say, erratic eye movements, or backward-looking, what we'd call regressions in terms of eye movements, where you kind of bounce around your eye around the page. If you're a proficient reader, you often read fairly smoothly through a comic page. But that it does boil down to proficiency. So as is the kind of theme of the whole book, the degree to which you have experience with comics will largely guide how you comprehend comics and understand comics, as is in the title.
Yeah, exactly. In the book, you're using methods of visual analysis that treat images as like sense data or just data.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed to be, as you say, it's your psychology book. So it was important to synthesize research in comics theory from, and I think, it sounds like an overtly scientific, quantitative perspective. Was that about trying to get a conclusive answer to that title question of the book? Or does this method make sense because it does let you aggregate large numbers of comic texts? Can the, I guess the, to boil it down, like, can the question of who understands comics be answered without this sort of robust method?
Good question. That's a really good question. So, I mean, I have throughout my whole career been doing sort of scientific studies of comics comprehension and structure, both on the representations and on the understanding. I'm trained as a psychologist. I actually as a linguist and psychologist, and my primary field is cognitive science. So to me, this is fairly natural, and I'm a largely data-driven and evidence-driven sort of theorist. So I'm not ever really just making things up. It's always based on some sort of analysis that uses some sort of evidence gathering. Even in pure theory, I'm doing things that involve, say, diagnostic tests, where I'm essentially testing my own intuitions against my hypotheses, and then testing it in experiments to see if other people share those intuitions. And I think that it depends on the questions you're asking, which methods you need to use. So if you're asking the question of, who understands comics in the sense of who are the people that can actually understand a sequence of images, which was largely what the book came out of, was an abiding sort of observation of that not everybody can understand a sequence of images. And I kept coming upon this in various literature, and it seemed so antithetical to what the assumptions were that you see across many people, that people talk about comics are universal and you can use them for everything, and you can use them to talk with anybody, and of course this is why everybody should love comics, because they're universally understandable. And then I kept getting all of these papers and data from my own studies that said, well, actually, your people's brains understand comics differently based on how much they read comics. And then you show these other studies that show people can't understand comics from various places, or that kids don't understand sequences of images before the age of about 4. And all of this kind of went against the predominant views. And so if you're going to if you're going to answer the question about who understands comics and how, who is it that is able to understand a sequence of images, you have to look at empirical evidence, because just sitting and thinking about common assumptions might be wrong. You have to actually look at, what's going on there, which is why I looked for years, in fact, trying to find all these cross-cultural studies that may show people who don't understand a sequence of images, why aggregated, many studies of kids using sequential images, because that's the only really the way that you can answer that question. And similarly, if you want to know what the structures are of comics around the world, you can make sort of casual observations about, well, I see, this is what looks like it's happening in manga, or this is what looks like it's happening in American comics. And your intuitions may be correct, and many theorists do have correct intuitions about that. But really, the only way that you can truly answer that is by looking at actual comics and tabulating what is going on with them within some sort of framework that allows you to address the questions that people are interested in. Because that's the data. That's if you're making a claim about how, say, one type of comic works, or even a single author, or comics changing over time, or any of those things. I mean, if you are just casually looking at comics and making claims, that's not giving you real evidence. So you might like I said, you might have very good intuitions and are picking up on things, but really a quantitative approach is the way that you learn what's actually happening. So that's been my guiding assumption. It's an evidence driven field of study and a manner of study. And it just happens that in my book, every chapter is some different type of source of quantitative data that I analyze, whether it's aggregating data that other people have gathered or reporting on data that has been gathered throughout my own studies. I just want to make one qualification, which is that this is not the only approach that is needed, right? So,
yeah, I like that you
or that
mentioned
can be done, which is that, like, if you have particular questions that can only be answered by a data-driven approach, then you should be using that. But if your questions are not involving this type of data source, then by all means use a different approach. If you are asking questions that are better approached by a critical discourse analysis or sort of theorizing about social issues or something like that, maybe you want to use a different method, and that's totally fine. I'm not a methodological determinist, but the methods should be guided by the questions.
I appreciate that, attention to language. I mean, these terms kind of matter. I think it matters in Who Understands Comics, for example, that you call, readers of comics comprehenders. You're talking about this group of people who are, the objects of your analysis in some sense, who are not, in your view, just readers. You're really trying to study comprehension, and you kind of name it as such. And that I think makes a lot of sense, because it doesn't dismiss what you term there like casual readings of comics that are really presupposing, like a literary analysis of a comic book or graphic novel, let's say, the terms matter, would sure. like presuppose a reader, it still would, or situate themselves as the like privileged reader of the book. And as you say, the method there, it would just avow its method, right, and go from there. And I think the thing I would ask you about, though, in the book at the beginning, you say the study of comics has always lauded itself for its interdisciplinary scope, and rightly so. Data matters here in terms of getting a larger picture of trends in comprehension. But what does interdisciplinarity do to strengthen analysis in a visual medium? And what impasses might interdisciplinarity avoid in terms of like visual analysis? Like, does it avoid that siloing that happens within academia in any way, or does it reinforce those silos? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have always been someone who straddles many different subfields. It's kind of a luxury and a curse in many ways, because I am someone who is essentially trying to build a new field looking at this sort of information in this way. And as a result, so it partially goes back to when I was originally trying to do this. It took me forever to get into a graduate school because nobody knew what to do with me. As at the time, there was nobody who really did this. And I was very clearly aiming to be in the linguistic and psychological sciences and cognitive sciences, but there was not anybody really doing this in that field. So people didn't know what to do with me. So I would kind of get like sent around, and I had lots of discussions with lots of different psychologists and linguists of different orientations. And one of the things so there was kind of a consistent thing, was everybody kind of said, oh, well, this is really interesting, but I think you're doing it wrong. I think you should be going about doing it, insert whatever way that they do research. So everybody kind of wanted me to do it like they were doing it. So I started out being very theoretical, and then I would talk to somebody who's like, well, you really need to be gathering data about different comics, because how else do you know what's going on? And I was like, yeah, that makes sense. So I just started gathering data. And then this is all before I was in graduate school. And then people were like, well, how do you know what people are actually doing? You need to run experiments to see what's happening, what choices people actually made. And I was like, yeah, that's a good point. So then I would go off and run an experiment. And then I found myself doing all of these things, So by the time I actually was in graduate school, being trained for more experimental psychology and cognitive neuroscience. On the side, I was still doing lots of theory, which my main mentor was a linguist, and so he was a theory, more theory driven, although he was very attentive to empirical research. And I also was doing corpus analyses on the side with students and things like that. So I just did all of these different things, and I have always persisted just doing all of these different methods at once. So formally, I think in the cognitive sciences and linguistics, you would say, these break down as like theoretical linguistics, psychology, and corpus linguistics, or something like that. So those are multiple interdisciplinary elements within the cognitive sciences. So I kind of just do them all. But I also invite other sorts of methods. And again, this is, I think, why I'm very driven by the methods you use come down to the questions you're asking, because maybe your training is biasing you to ask certain questions, because it comes back to the kind of the classic phrase that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think that's true for many people. Like they have, well, here's my solution for everything because this is what I'm trained in, and thus this is the answer to how you answer all the questions because it's the same thing. But if you're driven more by the questions themselves, then you have options, because then you say, well, here's these questions. I have all sorts of different methods that can answer these different things, but they answer them in different ways. So how do I really want to answer those questions? And that's the way I'm kind of guided. And I think that's how interdisciplinarity can arise in many good ways, because different sources of information give you different insights. And if you're able to take those different sources of information at face value and integrate them together, or realize where they are incompatible and or one might not be quite so good, it gives you a better sort of approach, as opposed to, say, positions where people just say, well, that's this, here's this line of methodology. I don't like that one, so I'm just going to reject it outright and not pay attention to whatever's happening in that entire field, which is, I think, very short-sighted.
Short-sighted yet commonplace at the same time.
Very. Yeah, and I think there's many reasons for that. People are comfortable with what they do, and that's totally fine. If you are from, say, a very literary humanities side of things, and then you pick up my very psychological book, maybe it's not quite that psychological, but if you pick up a book that's more psychological and suddenly I'm talking about brain science, it might seem unfamiliar to you, even though it might be actually very relevant. Just it doesn't have the things that the jargon you're used to. It might not have you're not used to looking at graphs or something. I don't know. So I could see where it might be challenging for people if you're not used to that. But I would like to believe, at least, that people can learn things from other disciplines, and I think that's important. And like you said, it's important for kind of breaking down those silos. At the same time, though, I will say that it's very difficult to be purely interdisciplinary and have no silo at all, because then you don't really have any place that you belong to. And that's a challenge unto itself.
That's interesting. Yeah, belonging is interesting. Like, comfort, being too comfortable is bad, but some comfort is perhaps necessary. Like, it gives your work intelligibility. It gives it a space, an audience. Kathy Weeks has written really beautifully about the ways in which, especially she has a book called Constituting Feminist Subjects, where she talks about like the paradigm debate between structuralism and post-structuralism, and how it's kind of like in the weeds. We're kind of struggling to figure out what we're talking about at a point where, or at a moment where really these labels should be functioning to help us. Mm-hmm. So yeah, comfort and disciplinarity, I'm really interested in that sort of relationship, but in a sense, how comics, the study of something like comics, which is a multimodal form of communication, tests our disciplinary muscles almost, or builds new disciplinary muscles.
Hmm.
Ones that are almost like just organically or naturally interdisciplinary.
Right.
Because yes, of course, like we need these categories, but it sounds as though your academic career was in part marked by these moments of methodological blockage, to use the term in comics, where you ran into somebody who intervened and said, like, that is not the right way to do it, and that blockage kind of rerouted you, and you had to like learn this whole other grammar, which was an academic method, and ultimately you got to this point where it's clear that your work kind of straddles, I would say, a structural and post-structural kind of critique. Like ultimately, Who Understands Comics is arguing that the appearance of greater transparency and at times complexity in comics gave birth to some contemporary assumptions that see the medium as somehow spontaneously a more intelligible, rich, or immediate way to communicate information without doing the work to put pressure on that assumption. But in, the visual language of comics, that's not really where your thinking is at yet. And in many ways, your findings have changed. And the biggest shift seems to be an attachment to a certain structuralist approach to language that has changed in the newest book, which you're now calling, that structuralist approach to language an outdated view of language.
Yeah. I mean, but that's funny that you have a very nice analysis of my intellectual thinking. Yeah, I mean, the in the visual language of comics, I was very much trying to convey aspects about the representations, and even though at times I think it depends how nuanced you want to be about the nature of the linguistic theories. One of the things that I think confused people, or maybe people were wishing for more information about when I did the visual language of comics, is nowhere in there do I kind of declare my allegiance to any sort of school of linguistics, because I'm not like a traditional structural linguist in a sort of Saussurean or early Jacobson style structural linguist from the early part of the 20th century. But I'm also, I'm more in the kind of current mode of construction grammar, but really I'm linked to my teacher's sort of model of language, which my teacher being Ray Jackendoff, who himself straddles different sort of linguistic theories. But I never stated that outright. So I think a lot of people made lots of assumptions about, well, he's a Chomskyan, or he's not a cognitive linguist, or people want to identify you into a camp. And I kind of on purpose didn't do that. But then it resulted that people made lots of assumptions about what I was arguing that weren't entirely the case. But ultimately, I'm both a kind of Jackendorfian linguist, but I'm also a psycholinguist, and I've been very much trained in psycholinguistics, and I've always tried to merge, my thinking about how these things work from both sides. So, my experimental work has greatly informed my theoretical outlook, and my theories inform the experimentation and empirical work. So I think what was different about the visual language of comics when I wrote it was I wrote that shortly after finishing my PhD, and there was a lot more theory there than there were studies that had been done empirically. And shortly after I finished doing it, we started running all sorts of experiments on all sorts of different things, kind of using the visual language comics as hypotheses in many ways, because it was more theory driven. So we then started gathering corpus data on the way different comics work, or we were gathering more data from brain studies, or we're doing more data from more studies on layout, and lots of different sources of data. And so what then Who Understanding Comics was able to benefit from was all of this additional data that we gathered, and that other people started gathering data. And so really the kind of theoretical core is the same. It's just that it's now oriented towards the results of the experimentation rather than the kind of guiding theory behind that experimentation. Now I can comment on the integration of the results of all that data that we were able to gather, which then further inform a new sort of theoretical output. So I've kind of found in all the books that I've written that they both serve as sort of like reports of the things that we have done already or other people have done already in integrating it and presenting it to people. But at the same time, they also serve as kind of a statement of work yet to be done and a forecasting of what directions should we go to learn more about these topics. So, and I think changing one's perspective as you learn more information is what you would really want out of science and the progression of a discipline.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're so self-reflective about method, and it sounds like your work with the Visual Language Lab has been an education for you in what interdisciplinary work looks and feels like, which I think is an interesting, like a different model from especially the perspective of someone who has a humanities training, right? Like my
Mm-hmm.
training, largely encourages you to, if you are entering into a conversation, enter it largely as an individual.
Mm-hmm.
And as Patricia Hill Collins points out, often in an almost like adversarial mode. And your mode is like totally not adversarial. It's about trying to build.
Yeah. I mean, I will confess, I
Yeah,
have been adversarial at times with various
sure.
theorists, sure, and theories. That's, I won't completely excuse myself from that. But yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
there's a combativeness in your books too, right? Like the sitta, right? This assumption of the transparency of comics is something that you take issue with. And it seems to me like that assumption of transparency is rooted in this kind of triumphalist impulse,
Mm-hmm.
a kind of triumphalism within comic studies, a desire to privilege what's assumed to be uniquely impactful about a medium that we love.
Yeah.
Um, and it's easy to cite studies like you do, that suggest people with autism spectrum disorder do tend to respond in positive ways to graphic texts. You write that they may assist understanding, decrease loneliness, increase social interaction, but there are still issues with just kind of resorting to a certain triumphalism, right? Um,
Right. And I think the case of autism is a good one because the guiding assumption has been that uh, even though individuals with autism may sometimes struggle with, or struggle is the wrong word, have a different processing orientation to text, they
mm,
don't to visuals. And visuals are kind of processed easily. But as I discuss in that chapter, um, it's a lot more complex than that. And while there is some evidence that individuals with autism prefer comics over text and receive great benefit from them, so do neurotypical individuals. Um, and there's also evidence that individuals with autism do things, at least neurocognitively in their brains, that are comparable to text in the way that text is processed in that sort of different manner of processing text is also happening in the kind of different processing of visual sequences. So it's not straightforward like visuals equal good for individuals with autism. It seems to be much more complex than that. And it might be that, well, visuals are equally challenging or have a different type of processing style the same way that they do for text. But again, if you have proficiency, then you're even better, and it helps you comprehend in ways that are more comparable to neurotypical individuals. Um, and again, it's not to say in that case that there's any sort of value on one processing sort of type over another, but so there are clear differences. But the main story is that it's not as simple as the kind of myths and stories that are perpetuated about these types of processing. And I did struggle quite a bit with this sort of SITA idea of sequential image transparency assumption, whether to call it a myth or an assumption, or, I struggled a long time on that acronym, and I don't know if I'm ever completely satisfied. But the idea is just that we hold various, predisposed beliefs about way things happens, and people repeat them over and over and over again uncritically, and then it turns out that when you dig deeper, it might not actually be holding up entirely. And comic studies, I will say, is filled with those. There's so many examples of these sorts of things that people have claimed and held on to over the years, and have never revised their sort of understanding of, despite loads of evidence to the contrary. A good example of this is the idea that you're filling in the gaps, quote unquote, in between each panel. And that's just, we've shown loads of experiments showing that is not true. You're not reading image by image, sort of fusing them together with some sort of, injecting, missing information in the space between panels. Again, first of all, that's a conflation of layout, as in the gutter as a physical space has some sort of meaning space there also. That's a mixing up of two separate things. And then there's just all sorts of evidence that you just don't do that. Sometimes you're doing more, weighty processing on the basis of the information that you're given. And sometimes you are filling in information that you're not seeing and doing inferencing and making inferences. But it's not at all the sort of process that is, comic studies sort of repeats in every single paper that you read, where people say, oh, you're filling in the gaps between every panel and it makes it a participatory sort of experience. Well, you do the same exact processing in pure language. It's not a magical thing that happens, but it's just different. So yeah.
One of the things that Sean Kleefeld argues in webcomics is that one of the unique things about webcomics is that they are these participatory things, right? There's a kind of direct link between you and the viewer. That's simply not the case in the kinds of comics that you're talking about, right?
I think that there's a case to be made. Well, I think there's a case to be made. It depends what you mean by participatory. If what you're talking about is participatory in the sense of your brain does something when reading a sequence, well, that's true of everything. It's true of language.
Yeah.
It's true of spoken language, written language. Yeah, there's few exceptions to that. And really, if you dig down deep, I've argued against, say, McLeod's notion of closure. Really what closure means is mind does something here. and kind of, it's a promissory note for what the mind is actually doing, which or brain is actually doing, which I hope I'm at least getting closer to identifying what is actually going on based on the experiments. But if that's what you mean by participatory, that I don't think is the case. But if in the case of webcomics specifically, if what is meant by participatory is the fact that you have access to the author, you can write on their message boards, you can reply to them, you can remix their things, because there's a whole remixing sort of meme culture online.
Right. You're building a different kind of visual lexicon in concert with your audience.
Yeah, exactly. In that case, yeah, that's absolutely participatory, because you are directly participating with your readers, right? And that's a different thing. But I think that is a very valid way to talk about the participatory qualities of webcomics, say, versus a print comic, where maybe what you are, the highest degree of participation might be the letters columns, or in older times, or off outside the context of the comic, talking to authors online or something. That's a different type of participatory experience. And yeah, I think webcomics do afford that. And it really just depends on the way that you're framing that participatory nature.
Yeah, and I think like there's a weird way in which webcomics have allowed for more kind of odd and potentially alienating, experiments in comics writing. Even Nathan Pyle's Strange Planet, which is this giant success, is an odd comic, just objectively.
Sure.
Um, and you note that complex layouts often require alternate routes, and that these artistic layouts will force readers or comprehenders to update the rules that they use to guide their reading.
Yeah.
I wonder, how much experiments matter in affording this kind of participatory experience, and whether comics on the web are a more hospitable place for that. I mean, there's a long history of like comics like Michael DeForge's and that test the boundaries of coherence, comics that are these surreal trips through trauma and memory and dissociation.
Right.
Do webcomics, do you see a shift happening where there's less of an emphasis perhaps on the pattern?
Well, I mean, certainly, I think even experimental books might be using patterns,
Right.
and they might just be using them in different ways, oftentimes. But sometimes they might indeed be breaking the patterns. And I think there's a couple related things going on. So, if you're, again, you can be experimental across any of those sorts of structures we talked about. You can be experimental in the layout, but not in the storytelling in the least bit. You could be presenting a very normal and conventional sort of layout, but really, pushing the boundaries of coherence in your storytelling. There's
About
different structures
promiscuous
you can do this.
transitions.
What's that?
Sorry, there's a term you use in the visual language of comics called promiscuous transitions that I like,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, which is a no, yeah. Well, well, that's kind of a theoretical idea that you're connecting every panel to every other panel, which is also untrue. I mean, it is possible to have that, but it would also overwhelm human memory if you didn't have
This is,
some
yeah.
sort of chunking mechanisms or grouping mechanisms involved also. Um, but the point that I was going to make is that so these sorts of challenging things that go against your the patterns that you have acquired will indeed often require some more updating as you go, because you're going to have to like revise your expectations a lot more. But there also seems to be an interesting phenomena is that um, that type of updating process might actually feel good as a reader to some degree.
Yeah, I love it.
To yeah, right. So like as you are given things that you might not expect, you have to do that updating, but that updating then makes you feel like, oh, I get it now, right? That sort of experience. And in some other lines of research, they talk about there being kind of a U curve of this experience where you're kind of negotiating between the cost of something, that is having to do more updating to work harder to understand something, harder versus easier,
Mhm.
and the pleasurability of that thing. So there's kind of like, in one corner there is, it's very easy to understand and very pleasurable, right? Um, but oftentimes the argument with this U curve is that things that are too easy to understand or are very easy to understand are not as pleasurable because they're just too easy. You're like, oh, well, that's what, so what? It's super easy for me to digest this. But on the opposite end would be something that is, you know, very costly to understand. And as a result of that, you don't find much pleasure in it. It's so hard to understand. You go, this just hurts to try to make sense of it. I don't like this, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea is that somewhere in the middle, there's this kind of sweet spot where it's just hard enough to understand that it forces you to do some, updating, but then you get pleasure out of that updating process, and that's the sweet spot. And I think often that feeling is what people mean by the participatory cognitive activity. That like I had to do a little bit of work to negotiate things that were a little bit unexpected, but as a result of that, I enjoy it. And I think that's what people really mean when they talk about, the participatory nature of understanding, comics. But again, it applies to, um, texts and jokes and advertisements and all sorts of different things.
Absolutely. And I think there's so many. I wanted to compare it to, art house cinema as well. The kind of the way in which some film can be completely unintelligible without a pattern, right? And in
Right.
many cases, these graphic texts can be comparable to art house cinema. And you've written about the connection between discourse, comic discourse, and film. And something you said reminded me of an exchange that I heard recently between Noah Van Sciver and a cartoonist named Sami Elwani, who has a book out with Conundrum Press, who's centered here in Nova Scotia. Elwani's book is called The Pleasure of the Text, and Van Sciver and Elwani are talking about whether or not a book as complex as James Joyce's Ulysses would ever be possible within the comics medium.
Hmm.
And, I wondered, and it's something that Van Sciver just says kind of spontaneously, but I wondered if that question made sense to you. Like, Ulysses is imagined to be like literally, Jacques Derrida wrote about Joyce in Ulysses Gramophone and talked about how Joyce's books reflect this idea that there is no more dense delivery mechanism than the book. And Derrida talks about two words in Joyce as generating, like a machine of meaning, this kind of endless supply of information. Do you understand the question, I guess, that they're raising? That like we're on this like trajectory almost that we haven't yet reached, where like Emil Ferris's, my favorite thing is monsters, and these books, which Jenkins writes about as this kind of masterpiece, that doesn't yet, represent the zenith of the complexity that is possible within comics. Does that question even sort of make sense to you?
Um, well, there's a couple counters I have to that. So one, I
Sure.
think certainly it's possible to make masterpieces
Mm-hmm.
with visual languages. Um, Secondly, I would say, what do you mean by complexity? Um,
Sure. Yeah.
and
Who defines it too?
yeah, who defines what that complexity is, and what are the properties of that complexity? If it's comparison to say Ulysses, then there's all sorts of structural things that are going on in there, right? That are interesting, and you could certainly do comparable structural things to, uh, obviously not identical, but given the affordance of visual sequencing compared to say verbal sequencing, yeah, you can make something comparable to that. Whether it's going to be as good or whatnot, that's up to people to decide.
Yeah.
Um, the other part about that is, again, to return to a point that I kind of make in Who Understand Its Comics, is that to some degree, I think it's counterintuitive and not accurate to think about comics as a uniform thing.
Hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
to think about, say, this is another one of those sort of zeitgeist sort of assumptions that people make ever since, say, McCloud's Understanding Comics, where he's and people frequently argue, well, it's a medium, not a genre, and etc. And then you look at the point I make in my chapter analyzing data from different comics from Europe, Asia, and the United States, is that there's systematic patterns that are happening in these different cultures in the way in which their storytelling and layouts and whatnot progress. And it's not just that the cultures are different or that places have different ways of doing things, but it's that they're systematically different in a way that's patterned, implying different systems that they are using. I would call those systems visual languages. Um, and so, if indeed it's the case that, say, Asian books are using a totally different sort of system that has underlying properties that are similar, but ultimately appear in very different ways, to what extent can we say there is a monolithic comics, quote unquote, right? Um, so, like, if your comparison for Ulysses is books in English, well, If you're then saying comics, are you talking about the visual languages of North America? Are you talking about the visual languages of the entire world? Then just kind of washing over the clear differences that appear in structure and the differences that then go along with that in who is comprehending those structures, right? So, like, a masterpiece from Japan might not be seen that way by someone who only reads American superhero comics because they have different representations of a different language. They have a different visual language that they're used to reading only superhero comics than reading only manga, and vice versa. So the definitions of what would then can be considered a masterpiece in one or the other is going to be constrained by the specifics of the structures of those different systems. So to some degree, it's doesn't make sense to talk about a masterpiece of quote unquote comics, because that's not a single thing, and there's multiple visual languages that are being used around the world to produce comics, and while they have similarities that can be compared, they are not entirely the same thing, right? And you see this sort of disagreement happening in sort of fights that people get into online, where people are saying, graphic novels, comic strips, comic books, manga, it's all comics, versus people who, will say, I don't read comics, I read manga. And those are not compatible. Obviously, there's a reason why those people get into arguments with each other, but they have clearly different understandings of the things that they're engaging with. And to my mind, at least, the empirical evidence is that indeed manga are different than comics. Even though they share various structural features, they have different properties, right? And again, there are social factors that an empirical analysis like mine won't bear in mind. Something like, Emil Ferris's books belong to a sociocultural context of, graphic novels versus, say, a superhero comic that's a floppy, comic. There is a sociocultural weight that each one carries that may lead one person or another to declare one as, a masterpiece versus another, that has nothing to do with their structural properties, and might have nothing to do with the quality of their storytelling even. And it has more to do with the sociocultural context in which they appear.
Yeah, I absolutely want to come back to this idea that you can just paint with, a broad brush and say it's all comics. In relationship to another thing actually that Kleefeld writes about in webcomics, like intellectual property in the age of the webcomic. But I wanted to pick up on something you said there, like that, the layouts, the grammar itself comes from the social cultural context that a comics tradition comes out of. This is something that runs throughout your entire work, and it's just, again, data driven. The fact that you kind of need to foreground difference to gain a real understanding of how human beings create culture. You need to have a deep understanding of the importance of that context. And I think we need to dwell in that difficult position of like wanting to lean into a certain triumphalism around, let's say, comics, or I mentioned music earlier, right? Like there's a certain kind of triumphalism, I would say, academically around music, especially in the humanities, as this like liberatory thing. And even in the sciences, its ability to help people reacquire speech. It's easy to just assume that music is magic, but what we're dealing with is not magic per se. It can be grasped, like, and I'm not even suggesting that texts in the humanities are predicated on like magic. That's not, you know what I mean?
No, I would not guess that's what you're saying, but yes.
But
Yeah.
they're dealing with ideas in a more overtly abstract way, and this is, I think, too, where there's obviously still so much room for the kinds of reading that Wanzo was doing and others have done within comic studies, like
Hmm.
Box Brown, for example. I gave he gave me an interview for the podcast, and at the end of that conversation, he says, like, one of the big benefits of comics is their ability to represent especially difficult and even traumatic experiences using symbols without re-traumatizing people.
Hmm.
And like the goal of graphic text that I gravitate towards is usually to figure out a way to communicate a certain competence in feeling that, film, I feel, can't do in the same way. Like being moved by the representation of somebody else's suffering definitely requires empathetic identification, and comics are very good at that, which is probably why they're sort of a cure for loneliness. But uh, um, you know, I think that competence in feeling requires more than just empathetic identification. The
Hmm.
aesthetic representation of violence, especially in comics, can either completely sensationalize the subject and desensitize us, I would say, still, that assumption obtains, or it can, and this is what I think really great texts do in the comics medium, they can kind of defamiliarize the feeling of looking at violence,
Hmm.
if you understand what I mean.
I think
Like
so. Yeah.
Box Brown's books, will sometimes use very cartoonish depictions of violence and conflict, and those can, in my view, allow witnesses to process grief without experiencing more trauma, and that's distinct from other media in some ways. Has your research found any evidence of that? Do you think comics have any sort of ability to prompt ethically and politically active modes of witnessing?
Um, yeah, I mean, that's a very fascinating question. I don't know if I'm the right person to ask that question, but certainly there's a whole subfield of graphic medicine, which
Yeah,
is
right.
a whole field devoted to the application of comics and graphics in medical contexts,
Hmm.
some of which include therapeutic, others which involve communication and health communication. So that's a very wide, encompassing study that I have kind of circled around and at least watched from afar, that I find interesting. And my sense is that there might be evidence, if I recall papers that I've looked at a glance, of therapeutic applications and whatnot. That I believe there is sort of empirical evidence of that,
Hmm.
but I'm not an expert
Right.
at that sort of reading.
Oh, no worries. I can ask you something that you are an expert on. You said
Sure.
you're not like methodologically. You don't want to be pigeonholed. You've been. It's. You mentioned that the closest you've come is to be called a Chomskyan, which really clicked for me, because it does seem like your work is, like so much work, indebted to Chomsky, and especially
Hmm.
in terms of, well, I'll get to it's this idea of kind of psychic continuity. You talk about how, like, Chomsky has a really deep understanding of how that works in terms of cognition, but like,
Hmm.
to just boil it down, like, there's these kind of different registers that comics operate in. Like, they can be really dense and unpatterned and experimental, or they can be very easy. And that seems to really hinge on this continuity factor,
Hmm.
like whether an author, whether it's just an industry producing something, is able to reproduce it endlessly or betray continuity. And like the example that you give, and then I think Kleefeld gives too, is Charles Schultz's repetition of particular panels. So
Yeah.
Snoopy on his doghouse becomes iconic, and you say, like, this is less a matter of self plagiarism than Snoopy being representative of a visual lexicon.
Yeah.
um, and Kleefeld is really talking about how that has been commodified, like how that psychic continuity of Snoopy on the doghouse becomes a source of just, like, massive profit through intellectual property. And it's true,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Oh
Peanuts,
yeah. Sure.
Garfield, like, and
My shelf is littered with, because so
yeah, me too.
in
Yeah,
our psychological experiments we use Peanuts comic strips,
sure.
in many cases. So many people have given me Snoopy dolls and toys as
Hmm.
gifts because of that, especially like graduating students. So my shelf is just covered in Snoopy,
Yeah.
dolls. So I can overtly see the commercialism on my shelf.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
and you know, like Garfield, of course, Jim Davis was like he's notorious for having sold the rights to
Hmm.
everybody who would buy them. So
Right.
Garfield, I grew up with Garfield being ubiquitous, but you
Yeah.
know, like what's interesting is like Kleefeld makes the claim, and I really like this idea that ubiquity has actually shaped the public's understanding of what comics are culturally and even structurally,
Hmm.
right? So continuity is conceptually important, but it's also commercially important.
Sure.
And so, like, and your work shows how poorly understood cognitively that repetition kind of is in terms of building
Sure.
yeah. And I see a lot of Chomsky in that, if I may say.
Yeah, at least in part.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like I will say, I am. There's a reason why some of my work, at least, is at least some regards Chomskyan, which is that first of all, linguistics is hard to escape Chomskyan ideas, and Chomsky is my academic grandfather. So my Chomsky was the mentor of my mentor.
Oh, I see.
So there is a bit of that, although
It's a lineage.
both, yes, so there is a lineage there, but there are many ways that both I and my advisor disagree with Chomsky's
Right.
claims about various things.
It's pretty biologically determinist in certain ways, right?
It depends. Yeah, it depends which aspect of it, but yes, see, it is. And I certainly have a lot more appreciation for the integration of the cognitive and social,
Hmm.
and or the integration of the biological and social, and the negotiation of that space. So I think in many cases people think, oh, I see tree structures on narrative, thus it's Chomskyan, but it's not. There's lots of linguistic theories that use tree structures. So um, I'm not strictly a Chomskyan, and in fact, my models greatly disagree with Chomskyan linguistics at this point. Um,
These models should be to some extent adaptable, right?
yeah, I mean, well, it depends what the claims you're making are, and in many of the claims uh, that you bring up about, say, patternedness, is somewhat the opposite of the current Chomskyan thinking. So Chomsky's latest thinking is very much sort of procedural driven. There's kind of a single mechanism
Hmm.
of generativity about language, and then it just takes the stuff that's in the lexicon and operates over it. And that's the opposite of what, say, theories of construction grammar believe, which is what I lean towards and my mentor leans towards, where really it's about patterns, and the patterns of language are very diverse, and you memorize, hundreds of thousands of patterns, not only words being patterns, but also sequences and phrases and idioms and the grammatical constructions themselves, and the grammar itself is part of these patterns that make up your vocabulary. And the grammar actually is included in the vocabulary. And ultimately, one of the big messages of the visual language of comics book, and a lot of my work since, has been, against this idea that drawings have no structure, and that there is no patterns involved, and there's an infinite number of structures involved with drawings. And that's just not true. That drawings are guided by structural patterns that you acquire, and like we were talking about, in learning to draw, you need to acquire the visual vocabulary in order to draw
Hmm.
proficiently. Um, and when you're talking about then, Snoopy on the doghouse, that is another established pattern that gets established by one author particularly, in production at least, unless there's lots of other people who then are drawing Snoopy on
Right.
doghouses, who acquire that pattern from him.
Which is easy to acquire, incidentally.
It is. It is.
You know, it's just so so ubiquitous. It's
Yep. And of course, comprehenders can acquire that pattern even if they can't produce it.
hmm.
So there's oftentimes with drawings an asymmetry between people's productive ability and their comprehensibility, right? So people can comprehend drawings, they might not be able to produce those same drawings, which is oftentimes different than what happens in spoken languages, where I can oftentimes produce language the same capacity that I can understand it. Although that's not true of all languages. So I live currently in the Netherlands. I have been learning Dutch for several years. I am very much not fluent in Dutch. In fact, right after I finish this podcast with you, I'm going to go practice my Dutch lesson for
Right.
today.
Are you using graphic texts?
I use Duolingo for
I
that
see.
mostly. But I can understand Dutch decently well at this point. Like if people are talking to me in Dutch, but I cannot produce it very well. And that's what a lot of people are like for graphics. They can
Right.
understand it comprehensively, but they just can't produce it
Mm-hmm.
to the same degree of fluency. So those people have acquired the patterns. They have acquired the pattern of Snoopy on the doghouse, but they might not be able to produce it. To the point of those patterns then being repeated all over culture, and informing what people think comics are. I think that's absolutely true. And this again goes against somewhat the idea of comics as a medium specifically, or being defined by its meaning making properties, like the idea that comics are sequential images, which is just doesn't it's not apparently the case. And I think indeed the ubiquity of elements from comics entering into broader culture absolutely informs what the way people perceive comics,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I mean, even with phrasing like a comic book movie, right?
Mm-hmm.
If comics were purely just a medium and talking about the way in which they communicate, which I think is problematic unto itself, as I talked about with regard to cross-cultural visual languages, then the phrase comic book movie should make no sense whatsoever, because you're essentially saying like the comic book medium movie. Like that's
Yeah. We don't say novel movies. You know what I mean?
novel
Yeah.
movies. That's really weird,
Yeah.
right? So in that way, you're seeing then comics as a sociocultural phenomena, which I think it absolutely
Mm-hmm.
is. Uh, but people are using the term in different ways when talking about different things.
Yeah, and it does seem to hinge on a certain kind of like politics of literacy. Like
Yeah.
Frederick Wertham wrote "Seduction of the Innocent" in the mid 1950s and seemed to hit on a certain moral panic around comics.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm thinking here about somebody like Wertham as a political figure and intellectual figure in the same way that Chomsky has become both things. Like
Mm-hmm.
he becomes a noted figure in American cultural politics because of seemingly his sense that comics actually could deter the development of like a literate population at a
Right.
time when the comics industry is actually seeing a massive kind of post-war boom, I think.
Yeah.
So it's weird that there was an audience for Werdum's anti-comics position, like,
Right.
and things have. It's weird how there's been a 180 where things have where the graphic medium is now seen as a kind of gateway drug to literacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Which
So weird.
also might not be as straightforward a position
Yeah,
either.
like
Right.
let's know what we're doing.
I absolutely think comics help with literacy. As far as I know, there is data showing that. But again, there is this sequential image transparency assumption guided behind many of those that notion of advocacy, right? As if, well, you get the visuals for free when reading comics, and thus it helps you learn the words, which isn't the case, because it's actually the case that when you're reading comics, you have to acquire the knowledge of the visuals and acquire the knowledge of the words and acquire how they go together. You have to learn how to do all that. That's you don't get any part of it for free, which is partly why I go back to talking about development. Like, well, kids don't understand a sequence of images until age of 4-ish, so how can they be expected to just get the images for free then in helping them learn to read? They have to develop both the fluency in the visuals just like they do of the text.
And I think your research could be such a boon for any kind of arts-based research in comics. I mean, it seems to me that not underlying all of it, but like a subtext, just in terms of having conversations with you about why you started, studying comics academically, like people read when they're having fun in general, not just when it comes to comics, you know. People read the novel if they like the movie. They buy the album if they liked a song that was, you know what I mean? Like there's people are driven by that kind of pleasure, and if we ignore that or don't attempt to diagnose it
Right.
objectively, we're missing a lot.
That's actually a very interesting statement, that what you find in many of the studies of the use of comics in education is two things. They are, in fact, inconsistent about whether, comics give, say, a benefit to learning. What you often find is that the largest benefit goes to the people who have the most experience with comics in the first place. So if you have the fluency, then you benefit. But if you don't have the fluency, you don't seem to benefit as much. However, in many of these studies, the enjoyment of the materials, of the comics materials versus the non-comics materials, is much higher for the comics materials.
Yeah, right.
So even if it doesn't seem to confer the advantage to learning for people who are less fluent in comics, they still seem to enjoy it more. And there is something to be said for that as well, in the learning process, that even if it's not giving you advantage, at least you're enjoying it more than some other sort of format for learning. And then maybe eventually, but out of enjoyment, you gain the fluency that you need, and then you benefit from it even further, right? But I think unless you have that understanding of the orientation of what's going on cognitively about issues of fluency, you can't just assume that, well, it's comic, so everybody's going to learn better now. And it just doesn't work that way. There's a lot more nuance involved here. And it's worth, that's not to say we shouldn't be doing it. I absolutely am pushing and emphasizing and encouraging the use of comics in education, but it needs to be done with, the mindset that it's not a magic bullet, and where it is beneficial, you need to know for what reasons it's beneficial at the same time.
Yeah, we don't need a gateway drug model of education or a magic bullet model. That's what got us into this mess in some ways. And we need to, I think, just, have definitely some degree of understanding of human psychology, and the fact that, people learn better when they love the thing they're learning. Henry Jenkins says in his book that we've seen a kind of increasing sentimentalization of everyday life that sees people holding on to things that have outlived their usefulness. And he says, like, comics have been this for him, and that we can't easily separate our belongings from our sense of belonging. And I think, that connection to text, which is increasing, I mean, like, web comics are great, but that specific connection to the sacredness almost of text as a delivery mechanism is sort of severed, in the relationship to an Instagram feed, I believe. But anyway, that's perhaps a whole other conversation. I've kept you a very long time. Thanks so much for making the time.
No problem. It's been a pleasure. It's been a very interesting conversation. It went in lots of ways that I didn't necessarily expect, but that's probably a good thing.